There was a wave linked to large-scale corporatization and privatization. In fact, Nemirov could be considered a pioneer back in 2005.
I was involved from day one in that conflict. We had a rather lengthy court case in London.
Succession, that's probably one of the hottest topics as well.
Interestingly, in this business, women tend to be more active, and that's perfectly fine.
I like to call the boards that are created simply to meet legal requirements boards by calculation, as opposed to boards by passion. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Board of Directors with Sergiy Bulavin channel. Today our guest is Yuriy Sorochynskiy. Good afternoon. Yuriy is the CEO of Nemirov, and he's also a graduate of the UCGA, the Ukrainian Corporate Governance Academy. What made you pay attention to this particular program and decide to join it?
Well, I'd say it was a natural next step in my professional development. Before that, I had 2 degrees in economics and in law. I practiced law for about 15 years before moving into managerial role. When I was appointed CEO, I realized I needed a different set of skills and knowledge. That's when I completed my studies at the Edinburgh Business School. Later, as I gained more experience, I understood that governance was the next direction I needed to grow in. I became particularly interested in the field of corporate governance. And through some friends and colleagues, I learned that a new opportunity had opened up here. A great opportunity, actually. It was Ivaras who helped make that opportunity possible. I was actually part of the second cohort, and I was really satisfied with the knowledge I gained. Because this time it wasn't just about management, it was about true corporate governance experience. A bit different, to look at the problem from another perspective. And as with any education, it's really just the beginning. That's where I got my initial foundation and a sense of direction for where to go next. Since then, I've been actively continuing to deepen my knowledge in this area and applying it in practice as well.
I also graduated from UCGA, and indeed UCGA does a great job of helping you truly feel the spirit of corporate governance, especially thanks to the professors from INSEAD. They're outstanding. It's genuinely an excellent and very useful program. From time to time, we mention in our episodes that there are 2 major schools in Ukraine, UCGA and CGPA. They're not really competing in terms of content. In fact, they complement each other very well. That's why we often recommend to our listeners, potential board members, and business owners who are building boards to definitely go through training, either at one or the other, or ideally both schools. Yuriy, you've been serving as CEO since around 2012?
Yes.
And up until 2011, Nemirov already had a board of directors, a supervisory board actually, and a functioning system of corporate governance.
First proper board of directors, in a more structured and formalized format, was established around 2005-2006. At that time, I was still working with the company because by the end of 2005, I had moved to PricewaterhouseCoopers from my position as head of legal at Nemirov. One of my final tasks before leaving was to build the company's corporate and legal structure. I wasn't directly involved in the first steps of corporate governance implementation, but I stayed in touch with the owners and followed closely how the process evolved. It really was the very first step, and at one point they even brought in independent directors. Later, however, the owners, since it was a family business, decided that perhaps independent directors weren't necessary at that stage. I believe this was largely due to the limited understanding at the time of what corporate governance truly meant for a business. The concept of independent directors was seen more as an advisory board rather than a fiduciary one. In fact, the owners viewed themselves as the fiduciary board, while independent directors were regarded as advisors.
At that time, this kind of practice was still quite rare in Ukrainian business. If you look at the history of corporate governance here, the first wave was linked to large-scale corporatization and privatization. That was around 1996 and onward, and it was only after 2015 that we saw the second wave, a broader recognition of the role of boards in business. In fact, Nemirov could be considered something of a pioneer in this area as early as 2005.
At the time, I don't think the initiative was viewed in those terms, though. It was more of a response to the ownership structure that existed back then. The company has been completely private since day one. There was no corporatization or mandatory board structure. In 2005, there were 3 founding families, and the board was primarily created to regulate relationships among co-owners, decision-making, approvals, and accountability. They implemented, I'd say, the best global practices available at that time, which, as I see it, helped the company navigate the very turbulent period from 2011 to 2014.
And we all know there was a turbulent period that, among other things, concerned corporate governance. That crisis, arguably, actually made it possible to draw certain lessons that were later taken into account when the corporate governance framework was formed.
I was involved in that conflict from day one and worked with a large number of very prominent international lawyers and law firms. However, a different level of insight and reflection came after my studies at UCGA, when some new perspectives on corporate governance opened up for me. And as I continued to deepen my knowledge of corporate governance, I became particularly impressed by the English legal system and its approaches to regulating these matters. I reflected on what happened back then, why it happened, and what the underlying factors were that formed the basis of that conflict, which proved quite challenging for the company. Much of the learning came during the conflict itself, through owners' interactions with lawyers and the protracted litigation process we had in London. I believe that experience also provided many practical insights for owners and helped them understand the need for a different corporate governance model.
Did that situation teach us lessons that should be taken into account when designing corporate governance systems for businesses? For example, were there vulnerabilities in the corporate governance system that failed to prevent or mitigate the situation in time?
In fact, I would say there are two parts to this. The legal structure established in 2005 was properly designed to protect the property interests first and foremost. It was built to protect the assets, not the individual interests of the owners. Those arrangements could only be undermined, arguably, by non-legal means. There were no legal instruments that would allow someone to overturn it by lawful means.
So, were there vulnerabilities in the legal framework?
None at all. The actions that were taken at the time were, for the most part, carried out in the non-legal rather than the legal sphere. On the other hand, we should remember the period between 2011 and 2014, when the decisions of an individual owner could not be enforced in Ukraine, even through the judicial system. That's one component. But if we return to the issue of corporate governance and the lessons learned, I believe that at its core, perhaps surprisingly, it all comes down to the classic agency problem. The agent decided that he was entitled to more rights than the principal had actually granted, and the agent here was the management, who attempted to take over the entire business. It was a textbook example of an agency problem. Nothing more, nothing less. I wouldn't attribute it to any other deeper reasons. That's simply my reflection on it. Of course, I can't speak for what was in the agent's mind at that time. But the outcome was clear. The London court concluded that such rights simply did not exist. In any case, neither the agent nor the minority shareholder at that time had or could have had the extent of rights they were trying to claim. Not under corporate documents, nor under the legal system, nor under any notion of justice.
Could we say that the corporate governance framework that was implemented helped us bring this process to an end?
It's hard to say whether it helped directly, but its absence would have undoubtedly created far greater problems. I'd say the first meaningful steps toward a more mature corporate governance approach actually began at the onset of the conflict. I recall how we held board meetings with lawyers present, and we genuinely prepared for those sessions in depth. It was in many ways a learning process. Both sides' legal teams were involved and helped ensure that, even amid the conflict, the meetings of the board of directors were properly organized and conducted. Of course, the outcome of those meetings didn't have any direct impact on the development of the conflict itself. However, later, when the matter was brought before the London court, the proper actions taken by the other shareholders, their adherence to the established rules set out in both the shareholders' agreement and the company's charter, clearly demonstrated the good faith of their intentions. The actions of the majority shareholders effectively disproved all the arguments that the minority shareholder had been presenting.
Based on this case, can we advise business owners who are now considering delegating management to hired professionals, or who have partnerships where differences in vision for the company's development may arise? Can we recommend, based on this case, that they implement a system of corporate governance as a safeguard and preventive mechanism against potential future risks?
I believe we can. Even back in 2004, when we began our preparations, and imagine in 2002 and 2003, we first learned terms like due diligence, and by 2004, we were introduced to the concept of a shareholders' agreement, we came to understand that such agreements include mechanisms for resolving various conflict situations. And I am deeply convinced that in situations where there is a partnership, it absolutely must be formalized in the form of a shareholders' agreement, or a partnership agreement, depending on the structure of the business. It's essential because relationships between partners will inevitably evolve. Partners may change, issues will arise, the business will transform, and attitudes toward it will shift over time. You can't anticipate and document every possible scenario, but you can set out the rules, how you act, how you resolve disputes, how you approach buyouts, sales, or disagreements. And I always emphasize this. Things truly reveal themselves when you're in a 50-50 partnership. That's the most complex arrangement, because when there's a 50+1 shareholding, everything is clear. But when ownership is split evenly, resolving issues becomes much more complicated. And when ownership is perfectly balanced, that's precisely when a shareholders' agreement becomes indispensable. Secondly, when the owners decide to delegate management authority to hired executives, they must clearly understand how to collaborate with management, how to structure the relationship so that the business can continue to grow while the shareholders retain a meaningful level of control, which is essential for both the company's development and ownership stability. Otherwise, there's a real risk of a classic agency problem where management attempts to take over the business due to the absence of proper corporate governance procedures. This is exactly where the shareholders' agreement and the corporate governance framework it establishes come into play. They define the limits of authority for hired management. They also set out how shareholders should make decisions, how quickly, how often, and through what processes, ensuring that business growth isn't slowed down, but at the same time preventing management from entering into risky operations that shareholders aren't prepared to endorse.
Succession is another very sensitive topic.
In my view, it's an extremely important issue. In many cases, it's ideal when family business owners foresee that their children or grandchildren will continue the enterprise, when ownership and management are passed on as part of a legacy. That means heirs and family members must be prepared for this responsibility, because relationships between the original partners are one thing, but relationships between their children are entirely different. They often lack the shared understanding and values that the founders had when establishing their partnership. And when you add a third element, a hired manager, or when one of the heirs wishes to take over management, this creates an additional layer of complexity. The relationships between owners, heirs, and family members involved in management must be properly structured and regulated. So, the scope of issues here is very broad. In Ukraine, we're only now starting to approach these questions seriously. After all, we've only been doing business for about 30 years, and many of the well-structured companies are just now reaching the stage of asking what comes next. Founders who started their businesses in their 20s or 30s are now approaching retirement age. They no longer want or are able to dedicate the same amount of time to the business, and the question becomes how to ensure continuity. And here I can say with full confidence, without proper corporate governance, it's simply not possible.
Absolutely. Corporate governance provides a framework for building a system with the right checks and balances. Without it, bringing in an external CEO will, in most cases, end up being a disaster for the owners.
Indeed, we've seen many Ukrainian examples where an owner decides to hand over management authority to a hired CEO, and typically the third one is the one who finally stays. The first CEO, as we often say, is the kamikaze. They take the role because it's a learning experience for both sides. For the owner, it's about learning how to work with a hired CEO. After all, they're not looking for a copy of themselves. A copy simply doesn't exist. Every person thinks differently, and that's why the first CEO rarely lasts long. This is exactly why having a properly structured board is so important. The board can help the owner navigate this first stage of integration with the newly hired CEO.
Yuriy, from my own experience with partnership agreements, from time to time, I often help business partners build partnership agreements. And very often when we start outlining all the terms, we realize that part of them can be formalized in legal documents, but another part, unfortunately, cannot be written down in any legal form. So what should be done in such cases?
I understand that not everything can be documented. In my view, the agreement itself, based on my experience with shareholders' agreements, is primarily a framework for decision-making, especially in a 50-50 ownership situation, as I've often said, because when ownership is uneven, it's fairly standard practice to outline which decisions require unanimous consent and which can be made by a simple or qualified majority. For example, if there are more than two people with different share stakes in the capital, in that case it becomes clear. We specify the decision-making process accordingly. If we identify key points such as these, we know that they must, without question, be decided unanimously. It's about agreeing in advance. If we're partners, business and truly care about the business, then every decision we make must be in the best interest of the business. It's about what's best for the business, not for anyone personally, because otherwise conflicts of interest or personal agendas will inevitably arise. From my experience, it's best to clearly define a list of matters that require unanimous approval and those that can be decided by a qualified majority. This ensures that the business can continue developing without paralysis. The company should never end up in a situation where two partners are unable to make a decision simply because something wasn't clearly defined in advance. We can't possibly foresee absolutely everything in life when drafting a shareholders' agreement. That's why we focus on defining those matters that must, under any circumstances, be clearly specified. For example, the materiality of transactions is an important criterion, or agreements and actions that could in any way expose the business to risks or potential harm. In such cases, as partners, we must limit the director's authority to act unilaterally. By setting those limits, we at least ensure that if the director oversteps them, we have legal mechanisms to restore the situation. Although personally I'm not a supporter of taking corrective action after the fact. Corporate governance should operate proactively, so as to prevent the possibility of such decisions or actions being taken. This requires proper reporting procedures, accountability, open discussion, and timely information sharing. That's when corporate governance works preventively rather than functioning as crisis management. And the more transparent the flow of information is for the owners, the fewer grounds there are for potential conflicts. I feel like there are things I don't know, that something's being kept from me. Why is it that I'm not aware of it, but he is, for example? When there's a fully transparent information sharing system, the element of trust naturally develops and strengthens, and there are far fewer reasons for conflicts to arise. On the other hand, as we know, agreements aren't drafted when everything is going smoothly. They're written precisely for situations when something goes wrong, to determine how we'll act if that happens.
Unfortunately, yes. But thanks to the lessons learned and the conclusions we drew from the business transformation that took place back in 2011, the cooperative relationships and corporate governance model that now function within Nemirov were built.
That was the learning experience we went through. During several board meetings, we were accompanied by legal advisors, and after the conflict was settled, we gathered with the shareholders and unanimously agreed that this model suited us perfectly. We understood how it allows us to maintain balance in a situation where there is no third party involved, just a 50-50 structure. Accordingly, we decided to continue applying this model further on, and to some extent it became part of my area of responsibility as CEO. To take on the role, it wouldn't be quite correct to call it chairman, but rather a leader who ensures that these agreements and procedures are observed in the company's ongoing operations. Since 2014, we have implemented this model and continue to operate within it. I have a scheduled board meeting next week. We formally hold such meetings 3 to 4 times a year. As I mentioned earlier, all the information needed appears in line with the established procedure when it's supposed to appear. There are no retroactive approvals of significant transactions anymore. Everything now moves forward correctly. If we plan something, it goes through proper approval and the corresponding corporate documents are issued to confirm the authority to conclude such an agreement. No approval, no agreement. So no one finds themselves wondering, why was this agreement signed? Why did management enter into it? We didn't even know about it. Corporate reporting in the format approved by the board is received on a regular monthly basis. As a result, the board is fully informed about all business activities, and all significant transactions and key matters requiring discussion are reviewed and approved in advance. These issues are discussed precisely during board meetings. For example, in 2018, we held an off-site board session in New York for a full week, as it was a major strategic meeting. As CEO, I was responsible for preparing the company's new development strategy. With the help of US-based consultants, we worked on it for about a year. Then, over that week in New York, the board went through the strategy step by step, discussed it in detail, and approved the long-term plan that still guides the business today. We don't find ourselves running around each year asking, what are we going to do next? Since approving it in 2018, we've had a clear understanding of our direction. Every April, the 5-year business plan is reviewed and approved. The board receives full information, confirms all investment initiatives and development directions, all aligned with the approved strategy.
Some owners, in fact, choose not to establish boards because they worry it might impose not exactly restrictions, but additional time costs, bureaucracy, and formalities. However, when the work processes and communication between the CEO and the board are properly structured, it always pays off.
Our real expenses were between 2011 and 2014. Without that conflict, perhaps the reaction would have been the same. After all, it does require time, quite a lot of it actually. At that time, when the question was about preserving and protecting the business, no one was talking about whether it required too much time or too many resources. The only thing that mattered was the core issue at hand. And it was precisely then that we realized in the future we must not repeat those mistakes. We have to keep moving in that direction. That experience, in fact, allowed us to understand, go through it, and move forward without endless debates about whether it's necessary or not.
Regarding ESG, of course, after the US elections, when Donald Trump came to power, ESG, which had already faced a certain degree of skepticism in the US even before Trump, effectively lost its position as a national priority. Today, it's hardly mentioned there at all. Europe, however, continues to actively support ESG principles, and many companies take them very seriously, including matters such as gender equality and balance between men and women, both on boards and within management structures. Interestingly, in Ukraine, the share of women in business management is actually higher than the global average. Yet their presence on boards remains significantly lower. How, in your opinion, could this situation be improved?
I believe there are probably two stages to this. The first stage is what we're currently witnessing, the development of corporate governance. In Ukraine, business has traditionally been and largely still is driven by men, and when they begin to realize that corporate governance is necessary, they each arrive at that understanding in different ways. Some genuinely go through training, while others operate without consultants or structured guidance. These are the initial steps. This explains, to some extent, why there are currently more men than women serving on boards. But I believe the next stage, an evolutionary one, will be the second. First, boards are being established, and eventually regular mandatory rotation will follow. Once rotation becomes standard practice, there will naturally arise a demand for new competencies and skills, the kinds that businesses increasingly need. So, the first stage is really the owner's own learning process, understanding how to work effectively with a board of directors. The next stage is when a broader demand appears for new perspectives, for something different. I believe that proper diversification within boards will logically emerge at this point, because women truly play a significant role in Ukrainian society and business. In many areas, they possess very different competencies from men. Even when I studied at UCGA, around 40% of my classmates were women. That in itself shows that they're developing in the right direction, building their future careers not only in operational management but also by bringing valuable expertise to corporate governance. I don't think forced measures will work here. It will happen naturally over time. Because let's be honest, 5 alpha males on a board will never really agree on anything. When there's a different emotional balance and the ability to look at a problem from another angle, the discussion becomes far more productive. And this isn't just about gender diversity, it's also about cultural, emotional, and experiential diversity. That's exactly the kind of diversity a board needs. After all, there's no point in having everyone around the table share the same point of view.
When I look at the members of CGPA, for example, it's roughly a 50-50 split. The same goes for the followers of my own professional channels, about half men, half women. But when I look at the boards I serve on, unfortunately the statistics are quite different. As for quotas, say the European approach, where they're quite common, I'd say it has given a certain push in the right direction.
On the other hand, I personally tend to oppose over-regulation. Any kind of quota is, after all, a form of regulation. I would rather focus on developing the maturity of the board customer, the business owner, in understanding what true governance should look like. We still have a lot of skeletons in the closet, reasons why some people don't want to or don't understand, or perhaps simply have different experiences. And, of course, everyone's story is different. On the other hand, Europe has been in the business game a bit longer than we have. So it's a completely different experience, a different mindset, and a different set of opportunities. In Ukraine, I think the country itself has simply not yet created the same kind of opportunities. The women who are proactive today, who see themselves in corporate governance and take an active role in their professional lives, are perhaps fewer in number, largely because of the surrounding environment. That's my subjective point of view. Yes, absolutely. From my own experience at Nemirov, not at the board level, but within the executive team, up until 2022, we maintained almost a perfect 50-50 balance. There were even periods when it was roughly 60-40, 60% women and 40% among among the top management team at the CEO level. And in many cases, that created greater harmony and overall effectiveness in our work than the current situation where I now have only one woman in top management. The circumstances of 2022 led to that shift. But even now, when I speak with recruitment agencies, I sometimes say quite directly, no, for this position, I specifically want a woman. Not because of any formality, but because I don't need just another male executive. I know exactly how valuable a different perspective can be.
Yuriy, I know you actively support women's leadership. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
That's exactly what I was referring to. I have personal experience, and I truly understand that the right balance within the executive team or the board of directors creates the ability to look at problems from entirely different angles. In order to see more women on boards, we first need to make sure they are visible, that we actively engage them. And to engage them, we have to support them in the processes and projects they lead and implement. I think this is something quite natural for Ukrainians. We don't create that us versus them imbalance. Equality has been part of our cultural foundation. Some of the women's leadership initiatives currently taking place in the country are ones that we as a company actively support by sharing our own experience. It's easier for me to speak about this because I've personally seen the benefits. When women are part of the executive team, it opens new opportunities for development, for different perspectives, and for solving problems in entirely new ways. Even looking at the company overall today, I can't say it's a perfect 50-50 balance, but it's definitely close, about 40-60. The number of women we've hired over the past year has grown steadily. On one hand, yes, mobilization has affected the workforce, but at the same time, we've adapted our work conditions to create more opportunities for women to stay employed. We can't forget that many of them are also mothers with children, and some have husbands or family members serving on the front lines. And this also means the psychological burden here is much greater. I believe it's our shared responsibility to create the right working conditions for them, because they want to be active, and they should be. They should be able to build a career, and they are doing so. In fact, despite all the challenges of the past year, we continue to move forward in developing leadership within the company and encouraging greater participation. And interestingly enough, in this business, it's often the women who are proving to be the most active. And that's absolutely fine. We support them, we provide opportunities for further growth, education, new positions, broader areas of responsibility.
And of course, this also affects the demographic structure. In reality, we'll be seeing more women, professionals, leaders, top managers, and naturally more women joining boards of directors, not only to restore gender balance, but also because, unfortunately, many men have not returned from the war, and that will inevitably have an impact.
Yes. At the same time, I'll repeat, we need different perspectives. What we don't need is one single point of view that everyone simply votes for. We need diverse perspectives from which we can find the best solution, not a compromise, but a true win-win situation. And I genuinely believe that women will contribute to this more. In some situations, they're not as impulsive as men. We as men tend to rush forward immediately, while women often act more thoughtfully, more calmly. They can stop for a moment, keep emotions in check, and take a step back to look at the bigger picture. And that's especially valuable in a boardroom, because if you lose that ability to see things from all sides, the board's effectiveness quickly disappears.
Yuriy, how would you describe the overall level of corporate governance implementation in Ukrainian business today?
In my view, it's evolving from two opposite directions toward the same ideal point, the model we would all like to see in the end. One direction comes from where the state mandates it, where corporate governance is required by regulation. The other comes from the voluntary side, when companies genuinely want to implement it themselves. When it's done under compulsion, we understand there will be distortions, especially since, in this case, the state talks about corporate governance primarily in relation to enterprises or organizations where the state itself is an owner or principal. And we all know our state's history is quite complex. I also look at it through the lens of what's called the agency problem. Corruption, in essence, happens when the agent decides they're entitled to more than the principal has allowed. So there's an evolutionary process here. On the one hand, you have private owners who are still learning, and on the other, state actors who are also learning. In the private sector, an owner voluntarily begins to understand that they need governance mechanisms to protect the future of their business. They're not planning to sell it. They want to pass it on to their heirs. They need the business business to survive and function independently. Meanwhile, in the state sector, there are external factors that force this process to move forward. And if we ask which path, voluntary or mandated, will lead faster to a truly effective governance system, I still believe that where there is freedom, there are more opportunities, more creativity, and ultimately more progress. However, the other side also brings valuable experience. In that environment, there's deep experience in interacting with difficult stakeholders. There are constant conflicts, and for members of boards of directors, this is a serious challenge. They must have the courage and competence to manage relationships not only with the state as a stakeholder, but also with groups within the state that try to position themselves as decision makers. So there are challenges on both sides, different in nature but equally real. Owner simply doesn't understand at first why they even need corporate governance at all. And here, for the board, for us, the real challenge is to explain, to show, and to help others understand. He doesn't understand.
Doesn't trust.
Because often the reaction is, what can you possibly tell me about my own business? But that's not what we're trying to talk about. We're focusing on governance, how to preserve it, how to manage risks and opportunities, how to ensure quality leadership selection, assessment, and management. Completely different aspects. When he was running the company himself, he made every decision alone. If he made a mistake, he learned from it. But how do you pass that experience on to your children? Will they really be able to feel it? That's why we're moving from two different poles. Because here, with the corporate directors, there will inevitably come a time for rotation and the need for renewal. Their experience, if it remains uncorrupted, can be extremely powerful in this context. At the same time, there's another kind of experience, one that can be valuable for state-owned enterprises and future corporate boards. Because here we have pure business experience, and they're a more politicized one.
When I teach at CGPA in the Corporate Governance Professional Association, I lecture within the Director Certification Program. I often say, the boards created due to the requirements of legislation are boards by calculation. And another side, boards by love. That's from this area of expertise.
Right. And people who join boards, the demand for competencies here and there can be completely different. Probably it's the businesses
that are already creating boards. And the boards within those kinds of businesses, yes, they're young. They may still lack certain experience and a track record of working on boards, and that's understandable. But if we look at global trends, we can see that the focus is gradually shifting. The emphasis is moving away from pure oversight and towards development. And that's actually the core idea behind boards in business today. It shows that corporate boards in Ukraine are in fact aligned with global trends, in some cases even a step ahead of them.
I absolutely agree. Yes, this is really more a question of my experience. And even now, as I reflect, yes, I realize that this is a question of how we develop, where we are heading, yes. Of course, traditional monitoring and control functions are still there, but they're no longer dominant. The real questions are we expanding? Are we making acquisitions? Are we ready to invest or not?
Especially now, given the current circumstances, there's a great deal of uncertainty and unpredictability, including around how to build strategy and what assumptions to base it on. It's a real challenge because most businesses today are trying to identify those sectors and directions where they can still grow, despite a certain stagnation that may persist for some time.
It also depends, of course, on the geography of the business, where it operates. Building a strategy within Ukraine is one type of challenge. Building a global strategy from Ukraine is another, because Ukraine still remains an essential part of the company's home market. And that's where diverse experience from different industries and different markets becomes a real strength when forming a board. Directors who bring backgrounds not only from one sector or one country, but who understand export and import operations and international cooperation can add tremendous value.
It's interesting considering that corporate governance and a functioning board structure can actually help prevent situations where conflicts arise between owners or between owners and third parties. In that sense, corporate governance can act as a sort of arbiter.
Yes, I'd agree. In some cases, it really does play that role.
On the other hand, when a board is properly formed and governance is well structured, it becomes a powerful driver for business development. And at the same time, it serves as a tool for effective oversight. So we're talking about things that are truly beneficial for business. Yet, in reality, there are still not that many companies in Ukraine that have established boards or adopted corporate governance practices. So the question is, how can we reach business owners and show them that this model exists, that it works, and that it can be valuable for them?
From my experience, the first challenge, the first barrier is the owner's perception of what a board actually is. Many see it as a purely advisory body. The very name, board, suggests to them, okay, what will you advise me? And their bias is understandable. I build this business, I know it better than anyone else. What could you possibly advise me on? But that's the first mindset that needs to change. And frankly, it's not even the hardest one to shift. The next question is this business being built for sale or for succession? Because even if the company is intended for sale, is it actually ready for that? And in such cases, you may not even need a fiduciary board. What you might need instead is an advisory board, a group of people with real experience who can take an unbiased look at the business and provide meaningful feedback. Because simply hiring consultants to come in, analyze and give a report, that's a completely different kind of expertise. Board directors who bring diverse and long-term experience can often offer a completely different perspective. They might say, this wasn't considered, but it could be done differently. And that's precisely where I believe the advisory board plays a crucial role. Through understanding the value an advisory board can bring, an owner can begin to move toward the next steps of governance maturity. It's about the owner's learning and development about what they've learned, because in many cases, these owners have never really been taught. In the Western world, for example, conversations at home, even when the children are young, often include talk about board meetings, reporting to the board, or preparing for board reviews. In other words, this becomes part of the so-called everyday lexicon, and it becomes understandable, and people talk about it in the informational environment. In contrast, if we look honestly at today's Ukrainian information environment, business topics are treated rather narrowly. Usually it's corporate PR, and that's about it. Everything else operates on a volunteer basis, and very few owners are actually willing to go and learn formally, even though their experience has already given so much to the business. That's why I say an advisory board can be incredibly useful. Succession planning, however, is a completely different story. Even the shareholders' agreement should already be addressing a key question: what happens if the owner is no longer there? And in the current wartime environment in Ukraine, that's a very real and serious risk. So, is the business ready for that? Are the successors prepared? Are there mechanisms in place to ensure balance and continuity so the business can keep operating? Who will step in as the successor? Has the owner truly thought about who will manage the business, maintain relationships with partners, and whether that transition will lead to growth or to conflict, division, or even liquidation of the company? This is a whole range of important questions, and in fact it's something that we, people from the corporate business world, should be explaining to owners. These are perfectly normal questions to ask. There are answers to them, but they need to be discussed, structured, and agreed upon. Because how will your children continue the business when you're gone? And who will make sure they don't lose it all? There are plenty of stories where the father built the business, the children lost it, and the grandchildren were left with nothing. How can that legacy be preserved? What tools are in place? A board of directors is actually one of the most powerful mechanisms for ensuring this. From a governance or ESG perspective, it's what truly provides long-term business stability. ESG became popular largely through its environmental dimension, but the G, governance, is what ultimately secures a company's resilience and continuity. I believe it's our role through various projects, including information and educational initiatives, to help business owners understand that this isn't about us looking for a job. It's not about hiring us. It's about preserving your business properly for future generations.
Yuriy, thank you very much for this insightful conversation, for your valuable advice, and for the detailed case we discussed, case of 2011 year, which highlighted so many aspects to consider when building a corporate governance structure within a company. Thank you sincerely.
Sergey, thank you as well. It was a truly engaging discussion with some very challenging questions. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. See you next time on our channel.